Professor Dino Pizzianiello is a graduate of the University of Adelaide, completing an honours degree in science and a PhD in the Faculty of Sciences, as well as a Master of Public Health. Dino has wide interests in the area of occupational and environmental health, including risk assessment and control, intervention research and education, occupational hazard surveillance, climate change impacts and adaptation, dermal exposure assessment, indoor air quality, work and vision, and young worker education. He is a chief or co-investigator on several very significant research grants, including some from the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet and the US government, as well as the Australian Research Council Discovery and Linkage Grants and SafeWork SA. Within the university, Dino is director of the Occupational and Environmental Hygiene Laboratory, and he manages OEH Consulting, a business unit of the Adelaide Research and Innovation Unit. Among his professional associations, he is presently the National Secretary for Australia in the International Commission of Occupational Health. He was promoted to the professoriate this year, and I'm delighted to invite him now to present his inaugural lecture. Dino.
Thank you, Alistair, for those kind words. Good evening, everybody. I should start off by asking the question, is work making you sick? That was meant to be a rhetorical question. I guess at the individual level, it may well be yes. On the population scale, the answer is probably no for most people. I must say that in preparing for this particular talk, I was under a bit of stress, trying to think about what to include, what not to include, and who would I offend if I didn't include this, that and the other. And I was reminded of Professor Rob Saint's remarks in his presentation earlier this year. He said, the role of the inaugural lecturer is to confuse a non-expert and to disappoint the expert. So I just want to apologise in advance to all these passionate health and safety experts in the audience that if I don't mention your particular hazard or your particular control measure, my apologies. So, on that note, what I hope to do in this presentation is to give you a bit of a feel around what that question actually means. Let's explore the question, is work making you sick? And give you a framework for thinking about risk. So in the lecture, I'll say a little bit about me, and Alistair's already introduced something about me and the field that I'm in, which can be broadly classified as exposure science. I have three key messages to start off with. One of them is about what we do and don't know in this area. Another one is in relation to the disadvantages of not being at work, and then the positive benefits of being at work. But with that in mind, a reality check as to how big the problem is in occupational health. I want to introduce the very commonly used paradigm worker-workplace to understand risk factors. I want to talk about some of the current risks that we're facing, particularly in relation to long hours, in relation to the use of computer screens, and so on. I also want to talk about young workers to some extent and the issue of musculoskeletal disease and its relationship with psychosocial factors. In terms of the future risks or emerging risks, I want to talk particularly about sedentary work. And I know that you're all sitting down here, so it is a bit of a risk at the moment for you. And also want to talk about blue light, something that most people are not familiar with. And then a positive take-home message. So as Alistair mentioned, I am a chemist by training, originally a postdoc in Switzerland and also in CSIRO at the Waite campus. I joined the health department as an industrial hygienist. Now, I actually didn't know at the time how, what, or why. What was this thing called industrial hygiene? I learnt in the government and then moved on to the university here at the Department of Community Medicine and established the laboratory initially at the Royal Adelaide Hospital and then at the Thebarton campus. Apart from being academic, I'm also a chief advisor to the fire services and emergency services for hazmat incidents. That's the chemical spill scenario, or the unknown chemical, or even the terrorist incident involving chemicals. So they give me a call from time to time to deal with that sort of thing. It's not always straightforward. At this point, I do want to make some acknowledgements, first of all to my mentors in the early days, Professor Stephen Lincoln and Andre Murbach, and then Chez Grigorsevich, who introduced me to industrial hygiene or occupational hygiene, which, by the way, is the assessment and control of hazards to health. I want to acknowledge Tony McMichael and in particular Dr. Richie Gunn for introducing me to the field of occupational medicine and occupational health. Having said that, probably the most important people in terms of the work that's been done are the students. They're very enthusiastic and hard-working past and current students, also my academic and professional colleagues, and my family and friends. So, what do I do? Although I'm an industrial hygienist, I think I would principally classify myself as an exposure scientist. But I'm not a medical practitioner, I'm not an ergonomist, I'm not an economist, I'm not a psychologist or a toxicologist, an engineer or a social scientist, although I do interact with quite a few of these professions most times. What I look at is interaction between health hazards and people, simplistically viewed as linking the hazard source to the outcome. So you can imagine a source of the hazard, let's say a factory with some air pollution. That air pollution is emitted, is dispersed into an environment or environments, and somehow people get exposed. Now, the next point is uptake of that substance into the body, which, depending on the dose, may yield a certain health outcome or several health outcomes, well, short-term and long-term. They're the possibilities. But hang on a minute, it's not quite that simple. We've got multiple environments in which we live. So, for example, we can be exposed to the smoke from somebody's barbecue across the fence. We can have our own barbecue and be exposed to the smoke. Or we can end up at open day at the university or some other function at work where there's a barbecue and be exposed there. So that's the contribution of all those little bits that represent the exposure and which have impacts potentially on our health. Now, this rather complex situation with regards to exposure has been dubbed the exposome. The exposome was a term that was developed or coined by get this right, Christopher Wilde, who's now the International Agency for Research on Cancer Director. He developed this term to complement the genome in the gene-environment equation. So I guess some of you know, maybe if some of you attended Rob Saint's talk, we talked about how we can find out about our genome fairly easily. We can supply a sample, push an online order, and we can get a whole genome sequenced, and all that information can be provided to us in the mail, as it were. Not so with information about our exposures. Often exposure is not known. We can't stick a device on somebody and measure their 24-hour noise exposure or chemical exposure, for example. So we have to rely on things like surveys, questionnaires, and so on, where we do have the possibility of misclassifying the exposure. So Christopher Wilde suggested this is undeveloped. Compared with the genome, the information we know about genetics, the information that we know about exposures, which is part of this gene environment process, is undeveloped, a bit like the small claw of a male fiddler crab. So there we have the fiddler crab with a very well-developed claw. We call that the genome, and the very small bit is the exposome. So that's part of the problem we're dealing with in terms of this area. If we think about the exposome and health hazards in the exposome, there are a range of these things which permeate, if you like, the exposome. Things like noise, radiation, viruses, heat, vibration, chemicals, all these things individually and in combination. We can have variable intensity, we can have variable durations, all of these things are possible, making for a very complex scenario in terms of individual risk. So we can have interactions between these risk factors as well. For example, we have noise causing hearing loss, but chemicals, or at least some of them, can cause hearing loss as well. And then there are some chemicals that interact with noise to make the hearing loss more serious than just the noise alone. So these things are possible, and we're gradually getting an understanding of how these interactions may occur. Another example which I'm going to refer to later on is the interaction between biomechanical forces in terms of their effect on musculoskeletal pain and discomfort, for example, and psychological stress. Biomechanical forces can independently cause musculoskeletal pain and discomfort. Psychological stress can also cause that through catecholamines and other cytokines and so on that really independently can cause pain. Put the two together and it becomes a question about how you manage that. Is it a psychological problem or is it just a biomechanical problem? This is an issue in the workplace. We're beginning to explore how we might understand that. But there's more. Some hazards may actually be mixtures of hazards. For example, fuels, combustion products. Cigarette smoke, for example, is over 4,000 individual substances. Minerals, when we dig up dirt, what's that actually mean? What's the dirt consist of? Lots of different things. Solvents. And they may also be time dependent. So let's take an example. If you have a spray painting process where you're spraying a paint out of a gun, the moment the droplet of paint comes out of a gun, it might have a certain composition. But 5 seconds later, it might change its composition because the solvent may have evaporated. Or there might have been some reaction that's occurring inside the paint droplet. So when we breathe in that paint droplet at a distance, it's not the same necessarily as the paint droplet we might breathe in close to the gun. We believe this is also the case with nanoparticles. Ultrafine particles do aggregate, they do change their toxicological properties to some extent with time, and that's something that needs to be understood. I like this slide. This is, I pinched this from Dr. Sam Brusky, who's a toxicologist who adapted a famous quotation from former Defence Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. And basically what the story is here are the known mixtures, in other words, mixtures we know, there are known unknown mixtures, in other words, we don't know, or we know that there are unknown mixtures. I knew he was going to get this incorrect. And that's probably part of the story, you see. It was so confusing to the audience as to what this actually means. But the biggest problem, I think, is the unknown unknowns. We don't know what we don't know. And there are scenarios and situations where there may be health impacts and we don't know about it. And over time, we do develop an understanding. But there are certainly things that we now know we don't know, particularly in relation to ultrafine particles and nanomaterials and so on, where we're in a work in progress situation to a large extent. So that's the exposure side of it. We have a range of possibilities there. In terms of health outcomes, in terms of disease, a disease can have multiple contributing factors, and exposure to a single hazard can lead to multiple diseases for a single person or multiple persons. Okay, so we can have a scenario where there are several hazards, each contributing to a disease. For example, noise, chemicals, vibration, causing hearing loss. That combination is possible. We can also have a single hazard causing multiple diseases. For example, benzene can cause narcosis at high concentrations, but it also causes leukemia, a cancer. The other scenario is where we might have one hazard giving rise to effects on multiple people. For example, ionising radiation causing birth defects in children. So, first message here is that we don't fully understand the health consequences of hazards or interactions between hazards, but the exposure criteria that we use are typically based on a single hazard. Now, that might be a practical reality for regulators, that you can't anticipate every possibility, you have to do something, you regulate on a single hazard, but it's not quite so simple when it comes to health outcomes. There's the distinct possibility we may be underestimating both the individual and public health impacts of this exposure. We need to take a precautionary approach with risk assessment and control. In other words, where we've got some evidence that the health outcomes may be very serious and irreversible, we should take action. We shouldn't wait until we gather all of the evidence necessary to prove the point. This is the precautionary principle. Okay, let's take an example and look at some of these uncertainties and issues. Let's take a hypothetical suburb with soil or groundwater contaminated by chlorinated solvents from historical dumping at an adjacent industrial site. Hypothetically. Let's hypothetically assume that there are 3 chemicals involved here: trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, and vinyl chloride monomer. These look all very similar, and they're necessarily, well, often are in combination. So say, for example, that's the scenario in the suburb. What are the potential health issues and uncertainties here? We know that in occupational scenarios, trichloroethylene can cause liver cancer. We know that vinyl chloride monomer can cause a form of liver cancer, and we have some evidence that perchloroethylene can also cause liver cancer. So, what happens in the combination? What happens if you got all 3 together? Do you have more than the sum of individual contributions? Do we know, or do we have less? I don't think there's literature to actually support that proposition at this stage. Take a single chemical which could cause kidney cancer, liver cancer, or non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. All of these 3 possibilities in the occupational scenario. We may think we understand the mechanism of one of these cancers, but not necessarily the other 2. Problem at the moment is that in the scenario where you have very young children exposed, there's an adjustment factor for one of those, which is the kidney cancer, but there's not an adjustment factor for the liver cancer or the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In other words, we think we understand that a mutagenic mode of action applies in kidney cancer, but we don't understand if there's such a mode of action for these other forms of cancer, and therefore there's no adjustment made for it. Other possibility is where trichloroethylene could cause birth defects, serious birth defects. And we're not talking about exposures here which are occupational. We're talking about exposures which are residential, if you happen to be living in an area which is contaminated. So here we have serious health outcome. We think there's some information that suggests that this is due to this particular substance. Which approach do you take? Do you look at birth defects or worry about women, or you do other things, worry about the general population? I mean, these are not black and white answers, but just to illustrate the complexity that can occur in real life situations. Okay, let's get back to the workplace. Here's a very strong message. Being unemployed can be worse, and much worse, from a public health perspective. This information was provided by Dame Carol Black, a UK physician, basically arguing that being out of work can lead to all sorts of health outcomes, including poor mental health, physical health, less money, of course, and transgenerational effects as well. There's one word in here which I think is actually quite important, and that's the word worth. Just keep that for the moment, and let's move on. The third message I want to bring across is that work is generally good for health. Where you have a job, it's generally good for your health. This is a statement by the Royal Australian College of Physicians and the Australasian Faculty of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. It's a positive statement that being at work is generally good for your health. And this again is another slide by Dame Carol Black, citing a number of famous historical figures pointing out the value of work. For example, Galen, who was a physician to at least one, maybe 2 Roman emperors, made the claim that employment is nature's physician and it's essential to human happiness. Voltaire, the Enlightenment figure in France, made the claim that work banishes those 3 great evils: boredom, vice and poverty. So it has a very strong social purpose. William Osler, the father of modern medicine, made the claim that to the young it brings hope, to the middle-aged confidence, and to the aged repose. I like the last one though. This is the one by Theodore Roosevelt, the former US president, who said the best prize that life offers is the chance to work hard at work worth doing. Again, the worth bit is very important in all of this. I would clarify or qualify that previous message by something like this. Work that is worthwhile and valued is generally good for your health. And we know from our own research and others that the organisation of work and psychosocial factors in the workplace are important determinants of health. It's how you perceive things, how people perceive you that are very important, and that a good safety climate is protective. Protective in two ways. Engaging workers and using their insights and experience to reduce exposures is a good thing. In fact, psychosocial safety climate or safety climate in general basically consists of things like management commitment, worker participation, communication and so on. So those are the ingredients that give you the good climate for minimising these risks. The other benefit that occurs is buffering of whatever effect is happening. So it's a bit like an anti-hazard. The psychosocial aspect of the workplace safety climate is a kind of an anti-hazard, all-purpose anti-hazard for dealing with hazards. And it's something that people have not really understood in the past. Okay, having said that, let's do a reality check. 2.3 million deaths annually for reasons attributed to work. Most of that being disease, which may come as some surprise to some people. And the economic cost of the order of 1.8 to 6% of GDP. In Australia, around about 4 or 5% of GDP. In Australia, according to surveys that have been conducted, this is not workers' compensation data. In 1 year, 640,000 workers, or 5.3% of the working population, experienced a work-related incident. Well, that sounds like a lot, but there are 94.7% of people who didn't experience it, so that's why I said on average, probably it's a good thing. Of this, 410,000 workers did not receive compensation, either because no application was made, in other words, it wasn't serious enough to do anything about it, or the application was rejected. So there's quite a few of these incidents that occur where you wouldn't make a claim, or you wouldn't even report it. This is an estimate or estimates of disease morbidity in 2008-9. This is non-compensated disease attributed to work-related exposures. Again, attributed, not necessarily proven. In terms of the estimates of morbidity, there are 5,000 Australian people who've got a cancer or a tumour attributed to work. 3,000 people with asthma attributed to work. 23,000 with a general respiratory disease attributed to work. And this figure was actually quite interesting for me. 30,000 people with heart disease attributable to work. So in Australia, we're talking, South Australia, we're talking 2,000 people attributed to work, which might translate to one person a day dying of heart disease in South Australia attributed to work, which is bigger than the road toll. But again, I'll just say that's an estimate. Time, well, I've got information here from Safe Work Australia, which is the national agency in health and safety. According to their figures, and this is workers' compensation data only, everything seems to be going down except mental disorders, noise-induced hearing loss, and occupational cancers. But these rates are, as I say, workers' compensation data, and not necessarily all the ones that have arisen when people have retired from their work and so on. And how much does all of this cost? $60 billion a year in Australia. In South Australia, $4 billion per annum. So for $4 billion, you can buy a new RAH each year if you wanted to. Probably worth looking into that. Okay, so what do we do about it? Assuming that this is All these estimates are correct, and we know that some of them are correct if we're using workers' compensation data or mortality data. How can we reduce this problem? We'll need to break these risk factors down into 3 categories. I'll attribute them to the work, the worker, and the workplace. So under the category of work, the risk factors could include exposure to various hazards. Now, this is the main area of my research. What sort of exposures are people getting to the various hazards? And to support in this area, we've had a range of PhD students and research fellows. The names are listed underneath here. We also looked at tasks, requirements, in particular, physical activity and so on, working hours, rosters, intensity, as well as supervision. So these are quite significant issues, and they're all modifiable. In other words, we can alter any one of these to reduce the risk. In terms of the worker, there are a range of non-modifiable factors. So we can't change somebody's gender easily. We can't deal with anthropometric factors. You can't grow another arm or extend it by another foot. And we can't do a lot about what's going on with community and family and so on. And you can't obviously do anything about the newness of being new to the work or the job. At some point, you've got to actually be new. And there are some subtle things, like whether you're left-handed or right-handed. We can't easily control that, but they do have implications in terms of exposure. And then there are modifiable factors, things like training, awareness, behaviours, use of personal protective equipment, sunscreen, physical fitness, acclimatisation. There's quite a few of those on the list. What about the workplace factors? Well, there's a whole range of those in terms of the physical infrastructure and ambient environment. If your office looks like a submarine, you've got no windows and the lights are a bit dodgy, then you might say, well, that's probably due to the workplace rather than me and my job. So, you know, there are those kinds of factors which are undeniable. And soil contamination and having a factory located in an industrial area does have its toll as well in terms of air pollution. And there are a range of other things to do with management and services. And safety climate, again, crops up very strongly here. It's what the organisation does with its people. What's the management commitment? What's the management prioritisation of safety? What's the communication that goes on in the workplace? What participation do workers have in decision making? And these are all constituents, if you like, of that safety climate. On the one hand, it could be the anti-hazard, and on the other hand, it's the recipe for disaster. Okay, let's have a look at some of these current risks and think about where we are. On the work front, a lot of people feel they're overworked. And it's probably true to some extent. There are a number of people who are working long hours, whether you use an ABS definition or whether you use an ILO definition. There's no doubt about it. There's some of us who like to work or maybe are required to work long hours. And information about how that interferes with their life, for the rest of their life, is an area of research by a group at the University of South Australia. They produced what's called the AWALI Index, Australian Work and Life Index. And it's basically the result of a survey of a whole range of people in different occupations around Australia. And this is what I'm going to base my statement here about. How does work interfere with life? So what was found in the AWALI survey in 2012, and I think there's an update coming, is that around about a quarter of Australian workers report that the work that they do frequently interferes with their capacity to engage in activities outside of work. Well, is that a high number or a low number? Well, frequently is the key word there, and you don't really know how many people have actually said other things or meant other things. But given that, women have a higher work-life interference than men, regardless of whether they're full-time or part-time. Interestingly, self-employed have the same levels of work-life interference as ordinary employees. And casual workers have no better work health outcomes than permanent workers when you adjust for differences in working hours. So there are a few subgroups here of concern and inequity. In terms of working hours directly, 28% of surveyed men work long hours, this is the ILO definition, and 9.7% of women. Now the problem here is for fathers, where there's a significant gap between the usual hours that they work and the preferred hours that they work. Around 30 to 40% report that they work at very high speed for most of the time, so 3/4 of the time working feverishly, if you like, working to deadlines, working in ways that represent more work than one person could do. This is the perception. 30 to 40% people are saying that. What does this mean for health? What's the evidence? We do know from a range of studies that long work hours is associated with adverse health. Now, those are not really solid figures in many cases, and the outcomes are pretty varied. Subjective physical symptoms and subjective fatigue and so on. But from some fairly more robust prospective observational studies, approximately 40% excess risk of coronary heart disease, where you take a cut point of 50 hours a week or 10 hours a day. 40% excess risk of coronary heart disease, which means that 1 in 5 Australian men are working with a 40% excess cardio heart disease risk because of their work. Well, again, the message is pretty clear. Health implications here are significant. Shift work, particularly that work that requires you to work at night, shift work involving circadian disruption. 1.4 million Australian workers there, with about 14% on average. Quite a number of people doing that kind of work. And we know from a range of studies that on average they tend to have relatively poor diets or be less physically active, have a higher body mass index and more likely to smoke and consume alcohol at harmful levels. So that's just a sort of characteristic of shift workers on average. Now recently, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which I mentioned Christopher Wild, previously the director, they classified shift work as a probable human carcinogen with an unknown or unclear mechanism. So in other words, being a shift worker is probably carcinogenic, but to certain people only, females and breast cancer. This is where the research is a little bit vague, but there's sufficient human evidence now to classify shift work as a human carcinogen. And there's a dose-response relationship with the duration of shift work. Now, some of the research that's come out of this university has added to that story. This is a paper that was published with a range of authors here at the University of Adelaide, where they looked at work schedules and child overweight and obesity. And the conclusion out of that paper was that work hours scheduled as non-standard times when work by the father or both parents were associated with child overweight and obesity. And the key message here is that children twice as likely to be overweight or obese if the father worked non-standard times. So there's more than just that other set of health impacts that we described earlier. This is a slide from Lynn Fritchie was at the University of Western Australia, looking at this set of outcomes, if you like, and possible solutions associated with shift work. And I just want to focus on the solutions. The mechanisms, as I say, all of this are a little bit unclear. But part of the solution is shorter shift rotations, dimming the lights in workplaces at night, and typically and better with a yellow light rather than a blue light, which I'll explain later. Better sleep strategies, improved availability of food and lifestyle advice, and to have a degree of sun exposure at appropriate times. This will offset to some extent the circadian disruption, if you like, and also those other more general environmental factors that apply to shift workers. Another possible solution is flexible work arrangements. Well, the Fair Work Act provides employees in workplaces the right to request flexible working arrangements. It's not always going to be granted. It's not always applicable. But Awali, in their University of South Australia research, has shown that workers who ask for that flexibility and get it have lower work-life interference than those who would like it and don't get it or don't ask. Sort of makes sense, doesn't it? But yeah, there's a little bit of self-consistency in there. If you've got the flexibility it does help in terms of reducing interference. Okay, next topic is computer screens. Well, how much time we spend looking at computer screens, including me. Okay, eyes lead the body. That's the message here. And computer workers will often assume awkward postures in order to position their eyes so that they can perform the work, and in so doing, passively experiencing musculoskeletal symptoms. There is a condition called computer vision syndrome, which has been described. Not everyone agrees with it, but there's no doubt that this is quite common and has a range of effects, including disturbances of the near vision and far vision, fatigue and headaches, probably arising from the musculoskeletal issues and the posture adopted, dry eyes depending on where the screen is relative to the eye itself. It's estimated that about 14 to 23% of computer users might have different degrees and types of these severe symptoms, which means about 1.5 million Australians. So what sort of things can you do? Well, obviously get your eyes checked, because that might be part of the problem. Make sure you have a screen which is big enough so that you can display the characters well enough, that you set yourself back around about a metre approximately, because that would overcome the accommodation and convergence issues, which leads to those pain, discomfort issues in the head and so on. For people who are older, working at a distance is always better as well. Make sure that you have the wireless mouse and keyboard. These will all help to reduce those sorts of issues. It's not the complete answer. The other thing is have your screen down below as low as possible, because that reduces the surface area of the eyes and therefore minimises the amount of evaporation. So the issues that come into play here are blinking rate. If you have the right sort of clarity on your screen, you'll have the right blinking rate. If you have the right position of your head, you'll reduce probability of dry eyes and things like that. These are all fairly common sorts of ideas, but it's amazing how many people don't actually follow those principles. It doesn't solve the problem completely if you're working for long periods of time. Now, everyone's got a mobile phone, and I wonder how many people have actually been walking down the street trying to text something and look at the screen and bumped into something or somebody. It's estimated that 10% of pedestrian injuries requiring emergency room visits result from accidents involving cell phones. And in some places, they've got padding on the Stobie poles or whatever to prevent people from banging into them. And of course, no one's actually going to say, well, I stupidly just walked into a pole because I was trying to text something. No one's going to do that. So this is the report from the US. Okay, let's have a look at young workers. I think this is actually quite important. We've got 1.7 million of these people, plus internationals. Now these people, young workers, are overrepresented in injury statistics, particularly the older young workers, given more responsibilities and greater durations and job tasks which might be hazardous and so on. And we understand that part of the problem is due to their lack of experience and skill. Part of it is because they actually have to do work that no one else wants to do. Maybe they're not fully developed in terms of physical development or psychological development. Maybe they're just not wired properly. You know, by the time you're 24, you have all your risk wiring correct, and prior to that, you're at risk, particularly if you're a male. And you may be wanting to impress somebody or unwilling to challenge. So a lot of young workers lack self-advocacy skills. They don't know how to communicate and ask the question. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's one of those areas which we understand now is to be very important in terms of young workers. And of course, there's also significant underreporting. So although the injury statistics say there's an issue there, it's probably bigger than what you see because of the underreporting, particularly for females. One approach to dealing with this risk is to educate young workers. And typically we do this in year 10 in high school or on the job. Now, we've done some research that sought to understand what is effective health and safety education for young workers. We surveyed high school teachers and interviewed parents as part of research that was published about a year or so ago. And what was the finding of that research? The finding was that there are two distinct contributors to this education. One is the school and one is the workplace. They have necessary and complementary roles. At the school level, it's all about giving them basic awareness, knowledge, and communication skills. So give them a curriculum which is accepted by industry. Perhaps use a system called Passport to Safety to give them a basic understanding, an agreed set of areas of knowledge in terms of rights and responsibilities, but also in terms of hazard management, basic hazard management. Give them the opportunity to act as if they were in a workplace and ask questions. So give them a safe environment to communicate. This is what's expected in the workplace. The boss will say, well, you should have mentioned it, you should have told me, but workers don't have any self-efficacy in that area. How do you give it to them? This is one of those areas that the school can contribute to in a relatively safe way. Another thing that can be done is to share experiences among students. Some of these students, by the time they get to year 10, they might even be supervisors. So they've got a story to tell to other students, and it's quite important. Interestingly, shock and horror goes very well. The more shock and horror, the better. It's likely to shift the attitude slightly. But along with that, a message of you can do it, and so on. Now, workplaces, on the other hand, should emphasise training. It's all about instruction. It's all about rules. It's all about supervisors walking the talk. It's giving them the specific hazard management skills that they need for that particular job. So the message is that you're not in Kansas anymore. This is a serious workplace. We expect you to do this, otherwise you're out. That's the message. It's not about trying to educate them or philosophise or whatever it might be. This is really about giving them an environment where they have to comply. Okay, and the reason for that is because they're not hardwired yet. And so they don't understand what the risks are. It's only when, well, if they have an accident, of course, they may well understand it, but then it's too late. So I think there's actually two roles of education, and they're both different, but they're necessary. Now, parents are not actually part of this at the moment. They could contribute at the school level. There's an expectation that they will, the school will provide them with something like this, but parents generally don't know very much about it. So at the moment, they're not contributing. Okay, let's have a look at some current risks and the organisational side of things, organisational safety climate. We've conducted a randomised trial of psychological interventions to address the prevention of musculoskeletal pain discomfort. This is a survey in South Australia. Paul Rothmore and I and others have been looking at a range of industries, looking at musculoskeletal pain discomfort because it is such a big problem, looking at interventions that involve a psychological component and compare that with interventions that just rely on advice, essentially from ergonomics, if you like. What we found was that after we adjusted for various factors, workers in companies with lower scores of safety climate, and this is the ones where there's not all that much communication and so on, 50% more likely to experience pain, 53% more likely to experience neck and shoulder pain, 280% more likely to experience lower back pain. So part of the story in terms of prevention of musculoskeletal disorders is about the psychological component and particularly safety climate. So as part of this research, we've recommended that employers employ somebody to survey their employees or do their own surveys to find out how they perceive the workplace and so on. Improve communication and worker participation in decision making. So they're the ingredients, if you like, of this improved safety climate. The University of South Australia has developed what's called the Australian Workplace Barometer and surveyed a range of industries in Australia using a somewhat specific psychosocial safety climate measure. And the early results out of this are that there are a range of industries with high psychosocial safety climate, in other words, the ones where you'd expect less of a problem, and there are other ones which are not so good. And in a few states, there are ones that are actually quite bad. And the idea of using this barometer is so that governments can allocate resources and prioritise interventions that address these kinds of issues, particularly psychological stress. Okay, emerging risks. Now, here's a list that I'm not going to cover. Climate change. Our research has indicated that, well, if we are going to have more hot weather, there's going to be more occupational heat stress. What our research has shown is that it's not just the heat-induced illness that's the problem, it's also the risk of injury. And it's not something that was previously recognised. And the issues there revolve around young and outdoor workers. Not a great surprise there, but it's something that the industries themselves have now got to grapple with, not just preventing heat-induced illness. Nanotechnology and ultrafine particles, the issue there is that we don't actually know very much about exposures and we don't know very much about toxicology. So it's an unknown, if you like, but we know about it. And then the ageing workforce. It's a bit unclear as to how much of a problem that's going to be, but there are certain groups who could well face more significant challenges. So older workers caring for aged persons. This is one group Paul Rothmore has suggested could well be a high-risk group in the future. Let me talk about some emerging risks. Sedentary work. Is sitting the new smoking? Are you all at risk? Prevalence of sedentary behaviour is increasing. Well, we don't have a lot of good data on that, but there's a lot of research that's been done on physical activity and specifically on sedentary behaviour. Around about 30% of people are sedentary, going up. We know that prolonged periods of sitting may not only be detrimental to people's health, but also counteract the benefits of whatever we regard as a good thing to do. Physical activity is the obvious one. But what tends to happen here is that you're not just physically inactive, but whatever benefit you might have got from physical activity has been cancelled out to some extent. So you've got a negative physical activity, if there's such a thing. Now, this is thought to be due to decreases in insulin sensitivity and abnormal processing of glucose and lipase changes and so on. So bottom line really is that you need to get up periodically to overcome these sorts of issues. Now, again, public health-wise, don't really know. It's sort of lumped together with physical activity, and it's one of those areas that probably needs to be further investigated. Health implications of that would be increased diabetes and cardiovascular disease risks. There's some organisations that have been proactive in this area. Telstra, in their new work areas, have attached, on a trial basis for volunteers, triaxial accelerometers to measure where people are going and how much they're moving and so on, arguably to improve productivity, arguably to design new work activities, but also in terms of physical health, in terms of the sedentary behaviour. So there's stuff going on, all sorts of apps these days, all sorts of wristwatches that have got indicators that it's time to move. So the technology to the rescue. The last one I want to mention is blue light and retinal damage. Now, everyone knows that you shouldn't look at the sun, as you're going to get damage to your eyes. The question is whether that's a thermal damage or whether that's a photochemical damage. Most likely it's a photochemical damage, although people have lumped together all these things in the past and talked about sunlight rather than blue light specifically. Now, in a systematic review, the evidence is that individuals with more sunlight exposure are at increased risk of macular degeneration. So the photochemical damage is being done if you're exposed to more sunlight. Not a great surprise. In an earlier study, there was a specific consideration of blue light, and blue light exposure was found to increase the risk of age-related macular degeneration, or probably just macular degeneration. but they were very hesitant about their conclusions. Difficult to quantify light exposure. That's still one of those areas. We still don't have the technology to get a real indication of blue light exposure. In other words, the light that's going into the eye at around about 440 nanometres. We don't have an easy technology for that at the moment. The photochemical damage is actually quite specific. If you look at this graph here, you'll see what's called the blue light hazard function. So the photochemical damage peaks at around about 440 nanometres and drops away quite sharply. And the risk, we know from animal experiments, is related to the brightness or the radiance, as well as the size of the image that's projected onto the retina. So this is actually quite a complex area. It's not only you have to worry about the light source radiance as it goes into the eye, but you've also got to worry about what your eye's doing as well, whether it's transparent and whether you've got a pupil size and all that sort of, what distance you are. There are actually quite a lot of considerations. The scary thing about some of this stuff is that there's a lot of products out there in the market based on LEDs, light emitting diodes. So you can buy these. I've got one of these. This thing here, I won't shine into people's eyes, but you can see it's basically just a white light, but it looks a bit bluish. When they did experiments on rats using these sorts of light sources and commercial light sources, they found some rather interesting things at domestic lighting levels. Again, this is the spectrum power function, where you've got a blue LED and a white LED, and there's actually quite a significant blue component in there. Both of them are able to cause retinal damage in this rat model. Bottom line is that these authors, which is published March this year, so it's not all that old, there's previous work in this area as well that suggests that these blue-rich white LEDs for general lighting might pose a risk. There's a recent editorial here by somebody in the US arguing that indoor lights could be harmful if they are too much of the blue. So when choosing light bulbs, and I'm not talking about fluoros here, I'm talking about the ones that are meant to be downlights and others, choose the ones that are warm rather than the blue. And the argument there is that blue light component can be a significant factor, or could be a significant factor. As in most things in life, light is good, but in moderation. Okay, just moving on to one specific example where one of my colleagues, Bruno Piccoli in Italy, has been doing work. He's been looking at metal halide lamps. These are the sort of specific lights that are used in shop fronts and display cabinets, and at places like Office Works. You've probably seen those lamps in the roof. Looking at the radiance, you find that sometimes they, depending on how long you're looking at them, can exceed the current occupational exposure criteria. In some contexts, these kinds of lamps are in the line of vision, in other words, directly to the eye, exceeding the guidelines after only a few minutes of exposure. Now, no one really knows about this, and no one's really looking at it. Who's looking at retinal damage? I mean, it's not the sort of thing you do in a standard test. And by the way, we don't really have a good way of looking at the exposure. So these are the sorts of things that require rather specialised research. So in this situation, photography, stage lighting, quite powerful metal halide lamps giving rise to radiances in the eye that exceed acceptable limits. This one's an interesting one in a department store selling shoes, where the person selling the shoes is on their knee, looking up, and I'm looking at all these lights here, thinking I better check that one, I better check to see what the radiance is. But that's an example of what I'm talking about. And this is an interesting one as well, where you've got a desk counter, but the lights are reflected off the glass. In measuring the radiance here, right in the centre of those dots, there's a radiance which will allow you exposure time of 1 minute, 1 or 2 minutes. So it's not, I'm not saying this is a huge problem. I'm saying that we don't know about some of these exposures, scenarios where workers may be experiencing irreversible retinal damage. Okay, here's the take-home message, which should be positive. Most of the risk factors we're talking about can be avoided or modified, and health promotion can be implemented in the workplace. And health promotion in two ways. One is in terms of the workers, but also in terms of this idea of safety culture. Getting that right is a big factor in terms of workplaces, at least as far as our research is concerned. Improved work health and safety is one of the greatest public health successes of the last 100 years. I mean, that's been declared fairly universally. But it's my hope that in the year 2114, some government report will cite improved work health and safety as being one of the greatest successes in public health in the 21st century. Thank you.